shadows in the attic. When Edward Faulkner arrived at the crumbling mansion in Vermont, he couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. The house looked like it had been ripped from the pages of a Gothic horror novel, with its looming gabled roof, ivy choking the stone, walls, and windows that glared down at him like lifeless eyes. Clouds hung low over the treetops, threatening rain, and the November air bit into his skin as he stepped out of the rental car. Home, sweet home, he muttered to himself, though the words rang hollow. The house, no, the monstrosity, had been left to him and his grandmother, Eudora's will. He hadn't seen the woman since he was 10 years old. She'd always been a figure of mystery and unease in his family, whispered about but rarely mentioned outright. His father had brushed off questions about her with vague comments about family disagreements and ancient history. Edward never asked for details. As a kid, he'd been too preoccupied with surviving his father's temper to worry about family politics. And as an adult, he'd written off the entire Faulkner clan as a footnote to his troubled childhood. But now, here he was, standing in front of her mansion with a crumpled will in one hand and a set of keys in the other. He shoved the keys into the lock and twisted. The heavy oak door groaned open, and Edward stepped inside, his shoes crunching on a layer of dead leaves that had blown into the entryway. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint tang of mildew and decay. The foyer stretched out before him, dimly lit by the overcast light filtering through tall windows. Dust lay thick on every surface, and cobwebs hung like tattered curtains from the ceiling. A massive staircase spiraled upward, its banister carved with intricate patterns that were now dulled by grime. Edward stood there for a moment, just breathing it in. The place smelled of time and neglect, of secrets left to rot in the dark. On a side table near the staircase, he found a note in a yellowed envelope. His name, Edward, was scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting he didn't recognize. He opened it and pulled out a single piece of paper. The words were short and to the point. Never open the attic door after sunset. Edward frowned. The handwriting was spidery, the loops of the letters uneven. Eudora's, maybe? He had no way of knowing for sure. It felt like something out of a cheap ghost story, the kind of urban legend teenagers dared each other to defy. He crumpled the note and stuffed it into his pocket. The first few days passed in a haze of exploration and unease. Edward roamed the house, trying to piece together who Eudora Faulkner had been. The library was a labyrinth of shelves lined with leather-bound books that smelled of old paper and dust. The kitchen was frozen in time, its linoleum floors and avocado green appliances straight out of the 1970s. The bedrooms upstairs were musty, their beds still made, as if waiting for occupants who had long since disappeared. And then there was the attic. The staircase leading up to it was narrow and steep, tucked away behind a heavy door at the end of the second-floor hallway. Edward tried the knob on the first day, more out of curiosity than anything else, but it was locked. The lock itself was a massive padlock, the kind you'd expect to find on a storage unit or a bank vault. It looked ancient, its surface mottled with rust. The attic door had a presence to it, a weight that didn't belong to wood and hinges alone. Every time Edward passed it, he felt its pull, a nagging sense of something waiting on the other side. By the third night, the dreams began. They weren't nightmares, not exactly, but they left him feeling uneasy all the same. In one dream, he saw his grandmother standing in a room bathed in candlelight, her back to him. She was whispering to someone he couldn't see, her words muffled as if by water. He reached out to touch her shoulder, but she turned before he could. Her face was wrong, too pale, her eyes wide and glassy, her mouth stretched into a too wide grin that sent shivers racing down his spine. In another dream, He stood in front of the attic door. Something on the other side was breathing, slow, heavy breaths that rattled like broken machinery. He wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The door creaked open, just a sliver, and darkness spilled out like a living thing, reaching for him. Edward woke up sweating, his heart hammering in his chest. During the day, he tried to shake off the dreams and focus on more practical matters. The house was a wreck, and if he wanted to sell it, he'd need to clean it up first. He spent hours hauling broken furniture out to the backyard and sweeping years of dust off the floors. But no matter how hard he worked, the unease lingered. The attic door became an obsession. He told himself it was ridiculous, that he was being a coward, but every time he climbed the stairs to the second floor, he found his eyes drifting toward it. He'd stand there, staring at the padlock, his hand twitching toward the key ring in his pocket. One afternoon he gave in. He tried every key on the ring, but none of them fit. Frustrated, he grabbed a crowbar from the garage and tried to pry the lock off, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like the door was mocking him, daring him to keep trying. On the seventh night, Edward gave up on resisting. He'd been sitting in the library, nursing a glass of whiskey when the old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. The sound reverberated through the house, low and mournful, and something inside Edward snapped. He grabbed his flashlight and the crowbar and made his way upstairs. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from his flashlight beam. The air felt heavier than usual, pressing down on him with an almost physical weight. When he reached the attic door, he hesitated. His hands trembled as he inserted the crowbar into the padlock's loop and pushed. The lock groaned, resisting, but finally gave way with a metallic snap. The door swung inward with a creak, and Edward's flashlight flickered. He stepped inside, and the beam of light swept across the room. At first, the attic looked ordinary. Piles of old trunks, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and broken furniture filled the space. Dust hung in the air, catching the light like tiny stars. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he moved farther inside. But then he saw it. In the far corner of the room, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a ripple in the darkness, like a shadow moving where there shouldn't have been one. Edward froze, his breath catching in his throat. He swung the flashlight toward the corner, and the beam flickered again. The shadow began to coalesce, its edges sharpening into a shape that seemed almost human, but not quite. It had no features, just a vague outline that radiated malice. Edward's legs felt like lead. He wanted to run, to scream, but he couldn't move. The shadow tilted its head, as if studying him, and a wave of cold washed over him. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a feeling, a deep, gnawing guilt, clawed its way into Edward's chest, dragging memories he'd long buried to the surface. The shadow shifted, growing taller, darker, its presence filling the room. Edward stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The beam flickered once, more, then went out, plunging the attic into darkness. Edward's scream echoed through the house, swallowed by the shadows. When Edward came to, he was lying on the floor of the attic. His flashlight was dead beside him, its plastic casing cracked. The air felt thicker now, colder, pressing against his skin like a damp shroud. The only light came from the open attic door behind him, spilling weak moonlight across the floorboards. The shadow was gone, or at least he thought it was. Edward scrambled to his feet, his knees buckling as if the strength had been sucked from his legs. His breathing was shallow, his pulse pounding in his ears. He grabbed the flashlight, fumbled for his phone in his pocket, and turned on its screen. The blue glow illuminated the space around him, but there was nothing to see now. The corner where the shadow had been was just that, a corner, empty, harmless, but he knew better. Staggering out of the attic, Edward slammed the door shut behind him and shoved the padlock back into place. Though it didn't matter. He'd broken the lock. The seal. Whatever had been in there wasn't bound anymore. That night, Edward didn't sleep. He sat in the study, the whiskey bottle from earlier sitting half empty on the desk. In front of him, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He stared at the blackened windows, at the reflection of himself in the glass, pale and hollow-eyed. Every creak of the old house made his head jerk up, his heart racing. The thing he'd seen in the attic wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real. Real in the way nightmares are real, in the way your deepest fears can crawl out of the dark and sit beside you, breathing in your ear. It had felt real. The guilt had dredged up inside him. The memories it had unearthed weren't the kind you could fake. The next morning, Edward did what any rational man would do in his position. He tried to convince himself it hadn't happened. He busied himself with work around the house, shoving the incident into the back of his mind where all his other unresolved traumas lived. He told himself he'd been tired, drunk, his imagination running wild. Maybe he'd passed out in the attic and dreamed the whole thing. That was plausible, wasn't it? But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The evidence began piling up almost immediately. It started small, his reflection. In the bathroom mirror seemed off, like the image lagged a split second behind. His movements. He'd catch flickers of shadow in his peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. The air in the house grew heavier, more oppressive, carrying a faint metallic tang that made his skin crawl. The dreams, too, returned with a vengeance. In one, he was back in the attic, but this time it was alive. The walls pulsed and breathed, the floorboards writhing underfoot. The shadow was there, waiting for him, but now it had eyes, two glowing red-hot coals that burned straight through him. It reached out with tendrils of darkness, wrapping around his wrists, his neck, pulling him closer. When he woke, he was gasping for air, his sheets soaked with sweat. By the fourth day, the attic wasn't just haunting his dreams. It was haunting the house. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, deeper. Sometimes they shifted, creeping toward him like ink spilled across the floor. Doors slammed shut without warning, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Objects moved when he wasn't looking, subtle at first, like a book nudged slightly out of place, but then more blatant. He came downstairs one morning to find every chair in the dining room stacked neatly on top of the table, and the whispers. God, the whispers. They started late at night, low and indistinct, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. Edward couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. He knew what they were about. They spoke to him, not in words, but in feelings. Regret, shame, guilt. It was as if the house itself was peeling back the layers of his mind, exposing every mistake, every failure, every sin he'd tried to forget. Edward finally broke down and called someone, an old friend from college, Sam, who'd always had an interest in the paranormal. Sam answered on the third ring, his voice groggy. Ed, what's up, man? Haven't heard from you in, 3 years. I need help, Edward said, his voice hoarse. It's the house. There's something here. Something I let out. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sam finally spoke, his tone was cautious. What kind of something are we talking about? Edward told him everything. About the will, the attic, the shadow. He left out the dreams and the whispers, afraid Sam would think he was losing his mind. Even as the words spilled out, he could hear how insane it all sounded. But Sam didn't laugh, didn't tell him to get some sleep and call a therapist. Instead, Sam said, I'll be there tomorrow. When Sam arrived the next afternoon, Edward almost hugged him out of relief. Sam was tall and lanky, with a mop of unruly brown hair and a faded hoodie that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. He carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, its contents clinking ominously. "This place is a nightmare," Sam said, looking around the foyer with a low whistle. "I mean, even without the ghost or whatever. Jesus, Ed, you could have warned me." "Believe me," Edward said, leading him upstairs. "The decor is the least of my problems." Sam spent the rest of the day setting up equipment. Cameras, motion sensors, an EMF meter that beeped every time it passed the attic door. He peppered Edward with questions. Had anyone died in the house? Any history of violence? Or tragedy? What exactly had Edward seen in the attic? The answers didn't seem to surprise him, though his frown deepened with every detail. By nightfall, Sam had rigged the entire second floor like something out of a ghost hunting TV show. He sat cross-legged in the hallway, staring at a laptop screen where the live camera feeds flickered. "You weren't kidding," he said after an hour of silence. "This place is crawling with activity." Edward didn't want to know what that meant. He didn't want confirmation that he wasn't crazy, that whatever he'd seen wasn't just a trick of the light. He wanted to lock the attic door, burn the house to the ground, and never think about it again. But it was too late for that. At exactly midnight, the cameras went dark. Sam swore under his breath, tapping at the laptop. "Signal's gone," he said. "Something's interfering." Edward felt it before he saw it. The shift in the air, the sudden chill that made his breath fog in the dim hallway. The whispers started again, louder this time, clearer. They were coming from the attic. "Stay here," Sam said, grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the door. Edward didn't listen. He followed Sam up the narrow staircase, his heart pounding. The attic door stood ajar, just as he'd left it that first night. The darkness beyond it was impenetrable, a void that seemed to pulse with malevolence. Sam stepped inside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom. "Holy shit," he whispered. Edward didn't have time to ask what he saw. The shadows surged out of the darkness, swallowing the light, and the door slammed shut behind them. Edward clawed at the attic door, his fists slamming against the wood until his knuckles split. It was no use. The door wouldn't budge, as if the house itself had decided to keep him locked in. The darkness inside the attic felt alive, shifting, and curling like smoke, but heavier, thicker. Edward could feel it pressing against him, worming its way into his head. He fumbled for his phone, the pale blue light flaring weakly in the suffocating gloom. It didn't help much. The shadows seemed to swallow the glow, leaving him stranded in a shrinking circle of visibility. His breath came fast and shallow, and he forced himself to focus, to fight the panic clawing at his throat. The shadow was gone, or at least it wasn't where it had been before. That corner of the attic was empty now, just an unremarkable pile of broken furniture and boxes. But Edward wasn't stupid. He could feel the thing lurking, waiting, watching. He crouched down and swept the phone light across the floor, looking for his flashlight. It lay a few feet away, its casing cracked from the fall. He snatched it up, wincing as his fingers brushed the jagged edges of the lens. When he flicked the switch, the beam sputtered but didn't come on. Of course, nothing worked in this place. "Okay," Edward muttered, his voice shaking. "Okay, think. Just think." But thinking wasn't easy when every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to get out, to escape this nightmare. He turned back toward the door and froze. The shadows around it were moving, slithering up the walls like vines, their tendrils stretching toward him. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." The attic felt smaller now, the walls closer, the air heavier. Edward stumbled, Back, his heel catching on an upturned chair. He went down hard, pain jolting, through his hip and elbow as he hit the floor. The phone slipped from his grasp and skidded away, its light spinning crazily before winking out. In the darkness, he heard it, breathing, not his own, though his breaths were loud and ragged in his ears. No! This was different. Slow, deep, rattling breaths that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The kind of breathing you'd hear from a sleeping giant, or something much worse. Edward squeezed his eyes shut, clutching the broken flashlight like a lifeline. He didn't know what he expected to do with it. Swing it like a club, hurl it at the thing. In the dark, none of it mattered. The shadow didn't need a physical form to hurt him. It had already started digging into his mind, dragging up memories he'd buried long ago. Stop it, he said through gritted teeth. Just stop. But the memories came anyway, vivid and relentless. He was 8 years old, hiding under the bed while his parents screamed at each other downstairs. His father's voice was a thunderclap, his mother's a desperate wail. Something shattered, a plate, maybe, or a glass. Edward squeezed his eyes shut, clutching his knees to his chest, wishing he could disappear. The argument ended with the front door slamming, and then there was silence. A long, awful silence that felt heavier than the shouting. Years later, he'd learned the truth. His father had stormed out that night and never come back. His mother didn't call the police until the next morning, and by then, it was too late. They found his father's car at the bottom of a ravine, the windshield smashed and the cabin crumpled like a soda can. The investigators said he'd likely been drinking, but Edward always wondered if the fight had pushed him over the edge. Edward shook his head violently, trying to dislodge the memory. It wasn't real. It was a shadow. It was using his guilt against him, feeding on it, growing stronger. He couldn't let it win. The breathing grew louder, closer, and Edward opened his eyes. The shadow was there. It wasn't in the corner anymore. It was right in front of him, its form vague but massive, a hulking darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe like a living thing. It had no face, no eyes, but he could feel it staring at him, boring into his soul. "I'm sorry," Edward said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm so sorry." The shadow tilted its head, as if considering his words. Then it lunged. Edward screamed and threw the flashlight. The shadow swallowed it whole, and the attic exploded into chaos. The walls trembled, the floor buckled, and the darkness closed in around him, wrapping him in cold, suffocating tendrils. He thrashed and fought, but it was no use. The shadow was inside him now, tearing through his mind, dragging him down into a sea of guilt and regret. He was back in his childhood home, but it wasn't right. The walls were warped, the furniture twisted into grotesque shapes. His mother sat in her favorite chair, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow. "Why didn't you stop him?" she said, her voice echoing strangely. "You could have stopped him." Edward shook his head. "I was a kid. I didn't know." "You knew," she said. Her face began to crumble, pieces of it flaking away like ash. "You knew, and you did nothing." "No," Edward screamed. "It wasn't my fault." But the words rang hollow, even to him. When Edward opened his eyes, he was lying on the attic floor, gasping for air. The shadow was gone, at least for now. The room was silent, the darkness no longer oppressive but merely dark. His phone lay a few feet away, its screen cracked but still glowing faintly. Edward pushed himself up on trembling arms, his body aching. He didn't know how long he'd been there, minutes, hours. It didn't matter. He had to get out of the house now. He staggered to his feet and made his way to the door. It opened easily this time, the hinges creaking softly, almost mockingly. The hallway beyond was empty, the light from the window at the far end pale and sickly. Edward didn't stop to think. He stumbled down the stairs, his legs barely supporting him, and grabbed his keys from the foyer table. The front door groaned open, and he stepped outside into the cold night air. For the first time in days, he could breathe. Edward didn't sleep that night. He checked into a motel on the edge of town, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and threadbare carpets. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the cracked wallpaper, his mind racing. The shadow wasn't just some ghost or hallucination. It was real, and it wasn't going to stop. He'd let it out, and now it was free to do whatever it wanted. Maybe it would follow him, or maybe it would stay in the house, waiting for the next unlucky soul to open the attic door. Either way, Edward knew he couldn't leave things as they were. He had to go back. Returning to the house felt like walking into a tomb. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and decay. The front door creaked on its hinges, and the silence inside was deafening. Edward climbed the stairs slowly, his heart pounding with each step. The attic door loomed at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. He hadn't left it like that. As he approached, the whispers began again. "You can't hide," they said, low and taunting. "You can't escape." Edward reached the door and pushed it open. The attic was waiting. The attic was waiting for him. A black void that seemed to pulse with anticipation. Edward stood in the doorway, gripping the flashlight he'd retrieved from his car. This one worked. He'd checked it 3 times before stepping back into the house. Not that it made him feel any safer. The whispers had stopped the moment he opened the door. The silence was worse. "All right," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Let's finish this." He stepped inside. The floor groaned beneath his weight, the sound echoing unnaturally in the cavernous space. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the same clutter of broken furniture and old trunks, but it all felt wrong, like the objects themselves were watching him. The air was colder here, thick and damp like a crypt. "Where are you?" Edward called out, his voice breaking. "I know you're here." Nothing answered, but Edward could feel it. The weight of its presence pressed against his chest, filling the room like a storm cloud. His memories stirred again, threatening to drag him under, but he fought against them. He couldn't let the shadow control him, not this time. He swung the flashlight toward the far corner, the one where he'd first seen it. The light caught something, a ripple in the air, a disturbance in the fabric of reality itself. "I'm not afraid of you," Edward lied. The ripple grew, darkening and thickening, until the shadow began to take form. It wasn't the vague, amorphous shape he'd seen before. This time, it was more defined, almost human in its outline, but stretched and distorted as if it had been twisted into something grotesque. "You can't run," the shadow said, its voice like the scrape of stone against stone. "You can't hide." Edward tightened his grip on the flashlight, his palms slick with sweat. "What do you want from me?" The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it moved toward him, slow and deliberate. The darkness around it seemed to bleed into the room, swallowing the light from his flashlight. Edward stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "You're just a memory," he said, his voice shaking. "You don't control me." The shadow stopped, its head tilting to one side, as if mocking him. "Do you believe that?" Edward didn't answer. He couldn't. The shadow surged forward, and Edward fell, landing hard on his back. The flashlight skidded out of his hand, its beam dancing across the walls before. Going dark, the shadow loomed over him, its presence suffocating. And then the memories came again, sharper and more vivid than before. He was 12 years old, sitting in the back seat of his mother's car. She was crying, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned. "White, it's your fault," she said, her voice trembling. "If you hadn't told him, if you'd just kept your mouth shut." Edward stared out the window, his chest tight with guilt. He hadn't meant to tell his father about the money his mother had hidden. He'd thought he was helping. He hadn't known it would lead to another fight, another night of shouting and broken glass. The scene shifted, and Edward was back in college, standing in a dimly lit dorm room. His roommate, Jason, was slumped on the bed, his face pale and drawn. Empty pill bottles littered the floor. "I didn't mean to," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. "I just wanted to sleep." Edward didn't know what to say. He hadn't seen the signs. He'd been too wrapped up in his own problems to notice that Jason was drowning. "I'm sorry," Edward said, tears streaming down his face. "I should have." But Jason was already gone. The memories kept coming, a relentless flood of guilt and regret. Edward curled into a ball, clutching his head as the shadow's voice whispered in his ear. "It's your fault," it said. "It's always been your fault." "No!" Edward screamed. "It's not true." The shadow recoiled just for a moment, and Edward realized something. It wasn't just feeding on his guilt. It was using it against him, trying to break him. "Get out of my head," he shouted, forcing himself to his feet. "You don't control me." The shadow hesitated, its form flickering. Edward grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, and the shadow shrank back, hissing like a wounded animal. "You're nothing," Edward said, his voice gaining strength. "You're just a parasite. You need me to survive, don't you?" The shadow didn't answer, but its form wavered, growing thinner, less substantial. Edward stepped forward, the flashlight steady in his hand. "You've been feeding on my guilt, my pain. But I'm done. I'm not afraid of you anymore." The shadow let out a guttural roar, and the attic shook, the walls and floorboards, groaning under the force of its fury. But Edward didn't back down. "I forgive myself," he said, his voice firm. "For everything." The shadow shrieked, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a windstorm. The darkness receded, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. Edward stood there, his chest heaving, as the last traces of the shadow dissolved into nothingness. The attic was silent. Edward sank to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. He didn't know how long he sat there, staring at the empty space where the shadow had been. When he finally stood, the room felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. The air was no longer cold, and the whispers were gone. He left the attic door open as he walked downstairs, the sunlight streaming through the windows, feeling warmer than it had in days. Edward knew the house wasn't haunted anymore. Whatever had been lurking in the attic was gone, banished by his own determination to let go of the past. He packed his bags that afternoon, leaving the house behind. He didn't need it. He didn't need the memories it held, or the secrets it kept. As he drove away, the mansion grew smaller in his rearview mirror until it was nothing more than a speck on the horizon. For the first time in years, Edward felt free. As Edward drove away from the mansion, the relief he felt was almost overwhelming. The house and everything it held was behind him now. He didn't look back again, keeping his eyes firmly on the road ahead. The mountains of Vermont rolled past, bathed in the pale light of the afternoon, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Edward allowed himself to breathe deeply. He pulled into a small diner on the outskirts of town to grab a coffee before continuing his journey. The place was quaint, with checkered curtains and faded posters advertising maple syrup festivals from years gone by. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, placed a steaming mug in front of him and smiled. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, chuckling. Softly, Edward froze for a moment, then forced a smile. You could say that. She nodded knowingly and walked away. Edward sipped his coffee, staring out the window. He wanted to believe it was over, that he had faced a shadow and won. But a gnawing doubt lingered at the edge of his mind, a splinter he couldn't quite pull out. The question wasn't whether the shadow was gone. The question was whether it had ever really been confined to the attic. Over the next few weeks, Edward tried to settle back into his life. He returned to his apartment in the city, unpacking boxes that had sat untouched since he inherited the mansion. At first, everything seemed normal. He found a new job, started jogging in the mornings, and even went on a few dates. But the shadow had left its mark. It began with the mirrors. Edward first noticed it in the bathroom after his shower. He wiped the steam from the glass and saw his reflection staring back at him. Except it wasn't quite right. His movements were delayed, just a fraction of a second, but enough to make his stomach lurch. He told himself it was a trick of the light, but the incidents became more frequent. The shadows started appearing in his peripheral vision, darting just out of sight. At night, he woke to the sound of whispers, faint but unmistakable. You can't leave, they said. Edward's chest tightened. You're gone, he whispered back, gripping the edge of the mattress. You're gone. But deep down, he knew it wasn't true. One evening, Edward received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just his name scrawled on the label in spidery handwriting. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was an old journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. A note was tucked inside the front cover. This belonged to your grandmother. You'll need it. Edward's blood ran cold. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the dense, cramped handwriting. Most of it was indecipherable, but one section stood out. The shadow is bound to our family. It feeds on guilt, regret, and sorrow. It cannot be destroyed, only transferred. If you try to run, it will follow. If you try to deny it, it will grow stronger. The only way to escape is to pass it on to another. The words hit Edward like a blow. He had thought he'd face his guilt defeated, the shadow by confronting his past. But he'd only suppressed it, driven it deeper. It wasn't gone, it was waiting. The realization came in the middle of the night, as Edward sat in his darkened apartment, the journal open on the coffee table. He couldn't pass the shadow on to someone else. The thought sickened him. He couldn't do to another what his grandmother had done to him. But what choice did he have? The shadow was growing stronger. He could feel it. It wasn't content to haunt him. It wanted more. Edward made a decision. He packed a bag and drove back to the mansion. The road was long and winding, the forest on either side cloaked in shadow. By the time he reached the house, the sun had set, and the familiar chill of the place seeped into his bones. The attic door was still open when he climbed the stairs. The room beyond was silent, but the air felt heavy, charged. Edward set the journal down on the floor and lit a single candle. The flame flickered wildly, as if it, too, was afraid of what was about to happen. He spoke into the darkness. I'm here, he said. I'm not running anymore. The shadows gathered, coalescing in the far corner. The figure emerged more, defined than ever before. Its hollow eyes locked onto him, and Edward felt the full weight of its presence. You can't escape, it said, its voice a low growl. Edward nodded. I know. He pulled a knife from his bag, the blade gleaming in the candlelight. The ritual was in the journal, scrawled in frantic handwriting. It was dangerous. His grandmother had written, but it was the only way to break the bond. The shadow surged toward him, its tendrils wrapping around his arms and legs, trying to stop him. Pain ripped through his body, but Edward didn't falter. He drove the knife into his palm, the blood dripping onto the floor. I banish you, he said, his voice shaking but firm. "I take back the guilt. The pain. It's mine, and you can't have it any more." The shadow screamed, a sound that shook the walls and rattled the windows. Edward closed his eyes, focusing all his energy on the words. "I forgive myself," he said, louder this time. "I forgive myself for everything." The shadow writhed, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a storm. The darkness receded, and the air in the attic grew lighter. The candle flame steadied, burning brightly. When Edward opened his eyes, the shadow was gone. The house felt different as Edward made his way downstairs. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by an almost peaceful silence. He stepped outside and looked back at the mansion. The windows no longer glared at him like lifeless eyes. The house was just a house now. Empty, but no longer haunted. Edward climbed into his car and drove away, leaving the past behind for good. This time he didn't look back. The red piano. Ethan was only 10 years old when he first touched a piano. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from an unshakable sense of destiny. Music came to him like breathing. He could hear melodies in his dreams feel, rhythms in the rain, and hum harmonies no one had ever taught him. His parents, neither musical nor particularly wealthy, didn't know what to make of their son. They couldn't afford lessons or a piano of their own, but Ethan didn't seem to care. He practiced on borrowed keyboards, played on A, neighbor's old upright whenever he could, and listened to classical records. Late into the night, it wasn't long before his talent began to draw attention. By the time he was 12, Ethan had won every local competition he entered. Judges would whisper about him to one another, their eyes wide, with disbelief at how someone so young could play with such depth and precision. Teachers from prestigious music schools sent letters to his parents, offering scholarships and urging them to enroll their son. It all seemed too good to be true for a boy from a small, unremarkable town. And then the letter from Blackwood Academy arrived. It was unlike the others, handwritten on thick, cream-colored paper and signed by the headmaster himself. Blackwood was no ordinary school. It was a place of legend, spoken of in hushed tones among musicians and scholars. It had produced some of the world's greatest pianists, but it also had a reputation for being peculiar. Students who attended Blackwood often emerged as prodigies, but some disappeared altogether, their names never mentioned. Again, Ethan's parents were hesitant. They didn't like the idea of sending their son away, especially to a place so far from home. But Ethan begged them, pleaded with a desperation they had never seen before. "This is my chance," he told them. "I can feel it. I'm supposed to be there." In the end, they relented. 2 months later, Ethan boarded a train with a suitcase in one hand and a battered sheet of sheet music in the other. The journey to Blackwood was long and surreal. The train wound its way through dense forests and over misty hills, the landscape growing darker and more foreboding with each passing mile. Ethan sat by the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he watched the world blur by. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though every time he turned around, the carriage was empty save for a few other students, all as wide-eyed and nervous as he was. When the train finally pulled into the station, Ethan felt a jolt of unease. The platform was deserted, the air thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth. A lone figure waited for them, a tall, gaunt man in a black coat who introduced himself as Mr. Graves, the Academy's caretaker. He led them to a waiting carriage, drawn by 2 black horses whose eyes gleamed like polished obsidian. The ride to the Academy was silent, save for the steady clatter of hooves against the cobblestone road. Blackwood Academy loomed on the horizon like a shadow against the sky. Its towering Gothic spires seemed to pierce the clouds and its cold stone walls were covered in creeping ivy. Ethan's heart raced as the carriage approached the wrought iron gates, which creaked open with an almost human groan. The courtyard beyond was vast and eerily empty, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Inside, the Academy was just as imposing. The halls were lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women, their eyes following Ethan as he walked past. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The other students whispered to one another, their voices echoing in the cavernous space. Ethan felt a strange mixture of awe and dread. He couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. The first few weeks at Blackwood were grueling. Classes began at dawn and lasted well into the evening, with barely enough time for meals or rest. The instructors were strict, their expectations impossibly high. But Ethan thrived under the pressure. He spent every spare moment practicing in the Academy's many music rooms, his fingers flying across the keys as if possessed. The other students watched him with a mixture of admiration and envy, whispering about his prodigious talent. It wasn't long before Ethan heard about the red piano. It was impossible not to. The other students spoke of it in hushed tones, their voices tinged with both fear and fascination. It was said to be the crown jewel of the Academy, a piano so perfect and powerful that it could elevate a player to unparalleled heights of greatness. But there were warnings, too, whispers of strange occurrences of students who had played the piano and never been the same afterward. Ethan was skeptical. He didn't believe in ghost stories or curses. He believed in music, in scales and chords, in the power of discipline and raw talent. When he finally saw the red piano for himself, he was struck not by fear, but by an overwhelming sense of longing. It sat in the center of the grand hall, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. Its crimson surface gleamed like liquid fire, and its keys seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off it. The headmaster's announcement came as a shock. Ethan had been chosen to perform on the red piano for the Winter Gala, the Academy's most prestigious event. The news spread like wildfire, and the other students looked at him with a mixture of awe and resentment. Ethan's heart swelled with pride. He didn't question why he had been chosen. He simply accepted it as proof of his brilliance. The first time Ethan laid his hands on the red piano, a chill ran up his spine. The keys were ice cold, but as he played, they seemed to warm, almost pulsating beneath his fingertips. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, rich, deep, and hauntingly beautiful. The music seemed to play itself, his fingers merely conduits for something far greater. For a moment, Ethan felt invincible, as if the piano had unlocked a part of him he never knew existed. But then the voices began. At first they were faint, like a distant choir. Ethan thought he was imagining things, perhaps a trick of the acoustics in the vast hall. But as he continued to practice, the voices grew louder, more distinct. They were cries, pleas, whispers of agony and despair. "Help us," they begged. "Stop the music. Stop the pain." Ethan tried to ignore them. He told himself it was just his imagination, a side effect of the stress and exhaustion. But the voices followed him, haunting his dreams and filling his mind with images he couldn't explain. He dreamed of skeletal hands clawing at him, faces twisted in anguish, their hollow eyes fixed on his. Yet every time he sat at the red piano, the music flowed effortlessly, drawing gasps and applause from anyone who listened. The other students began to avoid him. They whispered about him in the halls, their voices filled with fear and suspicion. Ethan didn't care. His fame was growing. Critics called him a genius. Audiences wept at his performances, and the Academy basked in the glow of his success. But deep down, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The red piano demanded more. Ethan's fingers began to bleed after hours of practice. The keys stained crimson. The voices grew angrier, their cries echoing in his mind even when he wasn't playing. The nightmares became more vivid, more horrifying. Ethan saw the piano's true form in his dreams, a monstrous creation of bone and sinew, its polished surface hiding a grotesque truth. He woke up screaming, his body drenched in sweat. He tried to talk to the headmaster, to ask questions about the piano and its origins, but the headmaster dismissed his concerns with a cold smile. "The piano is a gift," he said, "a gift that comes with a price. You should be grateful, Ethan. Not everyone is chosen." Ethan didn't feel grateful. He felt trapped. The music that had once brought him joy now felt like a curse. but he couldn't stop. The thought of losing the music, the fame, the adoration, it was unbearable. So he kept playing, even as the voices grew louder, even as the red piano demanded more. Ethan's descent into the piano's grasp was inevitable. At the winter gala, the hall brimmed with anticipation. Blackwood Academy's finest were gathered dressed, in their finest silks and suits, their faces glowing with a mix of excitement and pride. The air buzzed with murmurs about the young prodigy who would grace the stage that evening. The red piano sat waiting under the glow of countless chandeliers, its crimson surface gleaming as if freshly polished. Ethan stood in the wings, his heart pounding like a drum. The voices were louder than ever, a cacophony of anguish and desperation. They pleaded with him, their cries echoing in his mind. Please don't do it, they begged. Save yourself. Save us. Ethan clenched his fists, willing them to silence. He couldn't stop now. He wouldn't stop. Fame and fear drove him forward, propelling him onto the stage. The audience erupted into polite applause as he appeared, their faces expectant, their eyes fixed on him. Ethan forced a smile, his legs shaking as he approached. The red piano, it seemed larger than he remembered, its presence almost overwhelming. The keys shimmered like frost under the stage lights, cold and unyielding. He took a deep breath and sat down, his fingers hovering just above the keys. For a moment, there was silence. The hall held its breath, the audience leaning forward in their seats. Ethan closed his eyes, summoning every ounce of courage he had. The voices surged, their pleas turning to screams, but he blocked them out. His hands descended, and the first note rang out. The sound was unlike anything the audience had ever heard. It was pure and piercing, resonating in their very souls. The room fell utterly silent, the applause forgotten as the music unfolded. Ethan felt the pain immediately, sharp and searing, as if the piano itself had sunk its teeth into him. The keys seemed to pulse beneath his fingers, drawing something from him with every note. But he didn't stop. He played with a ferocity that shocked even himself. His fingers flying across the keys as if guided by some unseen force. The music poured from the piano like a living thing, haunting and beautiful, filling the room with its power. The audience was transfixed, tears streaming down their faces as they were swept away by the melody. Ethan's vision blurred, but he pressed on. The pain grew worse with every passing moment, spreading from his hands to his chest, his head, his entire body. He felt as though he were being consumed, his very essence being drawn into the piano. The voices in his mind were screaming now, a chorus of agony that matched the music's intensity. As the final note hung in the air, Ethan collapsed onto the keys. The sound reverberated through the hall, a haunting echo that seemed to linger long after it had faded. The audience erupted into applause, rising to their feet in a standing ovation. But to Ethan, the sound was distant, muffled, as if coming from another world. He looked down and saw his hands trembling, his blood soaking the keys. The piano shimmered, its red surface pulsing like a heartbeat, as though it had been fed. The headmaster emerged from the shadows, his expression unreadable. He approached Ethan with slow, deliberate steps, his presence cold and commanding. "You've done well, Ethan," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "But the piano's hunger is endless. It will claim you, as it has claimed others." Ethan tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy, his vision blurred further, the edges of the world fading into darkness. He felt himself slipping away, his body growing colder with each passing second. The last thing he saw was the headmaster's cold smile and the piano glowing, brighter than ever, its crimson surface almost blinding. But it wasn't the end. In the dim hours of the night, long after the audience had left and the applause had faded, the echoes of Ethan's playing still resonated in the grand hall. The piano sat quietly, its crimson sheen darker now, almost black, as though it had absorbed the light around it. The faintest whisper escaped its keys, joining the chorus of trapped souls that made its music possible. Ethan's presence lingered, his spirit bound to the piano along with the others. He could feel them around him, their anguish a constant hum in the background. He tried to scream, to escape, but it was useless. He was a part of the piano now, his soul forever entwined with its strings. He could only watch as the cycle began. Anew, weeks later, the Academy halls buzzed with excitement. A new prodigy had been announced, a young girl with an unparalleled gift for music. Her talent was unmatched, her ambition burning brightly. She approached the red piano with wide eyes and trembling fingers, unaware of the cries that would soon haunt her. Dreams. The piano gleamed once more, its hunger insatiable, its music eternal. The girl's first performance was breathtaking. She played with a passion and skill that left the audience in awe. But as the notes flowed, so too did the whispers. Ethan could hear them, the faint pleas of the others, warning her, begging her to stop. She didn't hear them, just as Ethan hadn't. The music consumed her, drawing her deeper into the piano's grasp. Ethan watched helplessly as the girl's descent mirrored his own. He felt her pain, her confusion, her growing dread as the truth began to reveal itself. The piano demanded everything, and it gave nothing in return. Her nights became restless, her dreams filled with the faces of those who had come before her. She saw Ethan, his hollow eyes staring back at her, his silent scream echoing in her mind. The headmaster watched from the shadows, his expression as cold and calculating as ever. He guided the girl with the same careful precision, pushing her toward the inevitable. The Academy celebrated her success, the audience showering her with praise, but the headmaster knew the truth. The piano's power was what they truly admired, its music woven with the torment of countless souls. Ethan's despair deepened as the cycle repeated itself. He could feel the piano's satisfaction, its hunger momentarily sated, but he knew it wouldn't last. The red piano was insatiable, its need for sacrifice unending, and so it continued year after year, prodigy after prodigy, each one drawn to the piano by their ambition, their dreams, their hunger for greatness. The grand hall remained silent in the hours between performances, the piano resting in the center of the stage, its presence almost alive. The whispers grew, louder in the stillness, a chorus of pain and regret that filled the empty space. Ethan's voice joined theirs, a faint echo among many, a reminder of what had been lost. Outside the Academy, the legend of the red piano grew. Musicians spoke of its haunting beauty, its unparalleled sound, its ability to elevate a player to unimaginable heights. They didn't speak of the cost, of the lives it consumed, of the souls it devoured. They only saw the glory, the fame, the promise of greatness. And so they came, one by one, each believing they could master the piano, each believing they could escape its grasp. But no one ever did. The red piano remained, its crimson surface gleaming in the candlelight, its music echoing through the halls. It waited patiently, its hunger eternal, its power unyielding. And in the shadows, the headmaster watched, his cold smile never fading, as the cycle continued, as the piano claimed its next victim.